and David's with us on the call, as Chris says, fortunately. Captain Cook Rediscovered is the latest book of David Nicandri. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Nicandri.
Nicandri. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. David Nicandri. It's the first modern study of to frame Captain James Cook's career from a North American perspective, recognizing that Cook sailed more miles in the high latitudes of all the world's oceans than in the tropical zone. The book focuses on Cook's voyages in seas and on lands usually neglected. The most famous protege, by the way, of this world-renowned explorer was Captain George Vancouver. David is the author of several other books on Northwest history, including River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, Arctic Ambitions, Captain Cook and the Northwest Passage, and Lewis and Clark Reframed, examining ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie. David was director of the Washington State Historical Society for 24 years, from 1987 to 2011. He's a former member of the Tumwater Washington City Council and Tumwater Rotary Club, which is just near Olympia, Washington, at the southern end of Puget Sound. So please join me in welcoming David Nicandri. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank all the members of the Ladner BC Rotary Club, especially Chris Offer, for the invitation. I want to thank Darlene Kemery, who is joining me as my audio-visual amanuensis. Darlene will be running through some slides. This will be a 17 or 18 slide presentation. I'll be prompting Darlene and she will be cycling through them. And just to highlight the few key themes before I ask Darlene to pop up the first slide. Cook is generally known as a tropical explorer, as that introduction ably demonstrated, but what I've tried to document in my Cook Rediscovered is that he was also a polar explorer, a pioneering polar explorer of the first rank. And I also tried to bring a new perspective to Cook's third voyage. So Darlene, if we could go to the first slide.
Okay, can everyone see it?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Has the host been turned over to me?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me say, just to backfill a little bit, I want to have everyone notice that I put on my Mackenzie tartan shirt for today's presentation, just to get part of the Northwest exploration theme going.
Okay, hold on.
Here we go.
It's been finicky today.
One thing hasn't changed with Rotary. Technology is problematic.
Yeah.
It's just a constant. I remember the old slide projectors, bulbs would burn out. It'd be hard to bring them into focus. When we get the slides going, though, you'll see that it was worth the wait. Okay, we can go to the next one. That's the book cover. Thank you, Darlene. Our first slide after this one.
I've got a spinning cycle here. They call it the popsicle of death.
This book, by the way, can be ordered from the University of British Columbia Press directly, or Amazon.ca if anyone is so inclined. There's not much of a price differential from what I've been able to tell recently. So just taking time for everything to load, Darlene.
Yeah, for some reason, it's trying to open it twice. Can you see the book cover?
I can see the book cover, yes, but can you,
All
can
right.
you move? Can you move to the next slide?
I've got a spinning little circle here. This doesn't normally happen.
Is there any other club business we can go to in the short term, Mr. President, while Darlene sorts out the technical problem?
Sure. Are there any club announcements?
Oh, here we go.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well, back to you.
Ready. Thank you. So Cook, of course, was a Yorkshireman, worked in the famous coal trade, east coast of Great Britain, Baltic Sea, joined the Royal Navy just in time to participate in the British conquest of Quebec. This is his famous chart of the basin before the citadel. He was, because of his great promise, he was quickly commissioned to do the survey of Newfoundland, which you'll recognize here. This was one of Cook's first published maps. Arguably, it's still one of his best. Many of you have probably been to Newfoundland, that has a notoriously vexatious coastline. Cook was able to survey it in all of its complexity. And it was, in fact, this work that brought him to the attention of the British Admiralty for his next assignment. Next slide, please. I want you to remember this image. This is from Captain Antoine de Bougainville's chart of the Pacific, published while Cook was, in fact, on his second voyage to the South Pacific. You'll be able to see off to the left kind of a recognizable delineation of the western side of Australia. There's a hint of the New Zealand coastline to the southeast of it, and a very sparse population of the tropical zone of the almost 1,000 some islands and islands of the South Pacific. Bougainville, by the way, was in Montcalm's command at Quebec, and probably more than any other individual with the French command, was responsible for laying the groundwork for Wolfe's great victory. Curiously enough, although Cook and Bougainville did not meet in Quebec, they did cross paths in the Pacific. Bougainville was in the South Pacific a couple of years before Freudian slip, before Cook's first voyage. Cook was commissioned after his excellent work in Canada, particularly the Newfoundland survey, to conduct an astronomical experiment somewhere in the tropical zone to observe the transit of Venus across the face of the sun, one of the three great Enlightenment era quests for Enlightenment era science with which Captain Cook was inextricably linked. Cook was sent to Tahiti through a very complex astronomical formula to time and measure the transit of Venus across the face of the Earth, across the face of the sun's face. And through that formulation, it would have been possible to determine the distance of the sun from the Earth, from Venus, Earth to Venus, etc. That was Cook's first mission. But remember this slide to the extent that you can. Next one, Darlene. Cook returned from that voyage to great fanfare after establishing the insular nature of New Zealand, mapping the east coast of the continent of Australia, New South Wales, as he named it. And he was immediately given a second command to search for the second great interest of geography and science from the Enlightenment era. And that was the notion of the mythical southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita. The reigning theory of geographers at that time is that there had to be a landmass in the southern hemisphere that measured the dimension of Eurasia in the northern hemisphere, Otherwise, the world would wobble on its axis as it revolved. No one had quite delineated this southern mass, but theoretically existed. It was the second great quest of Enlightenment science, and Cook was sent out to the mid to high latitudes of the southern hemisphere, serially in the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean, looking for Terra Australis Incognita. Next slide, please. Of course, as we all know, and we know it because of Cook's voyage, Terra Australis Incognita does not exist. There's the remnant of that concept in the form of Australia. But in the classic vision, Terra Australis Incognita would have been the size of Russia, or Russia with the European appendage, and it did not exist. And but what Cook did discover in the southern hemisphere were these masses, just a huge volume of frozen water, ice, both in its iceberg form, as you see in this slide, or low pack ice, which he frequently encountered. In fact, he encountered serially in every of the southern oceans, Indian, Pacific, Atlantic, in that order, as he kept probing, crisscrossing the southern hemisphere, looking for this continent, which he proved thereby that it did not exist. But he did founder upon this corresponding and newfound issue, which is, where is all of this ice coming from if there's no continent for it to emerge? Next slide. The reigning theory at the time was that the ice one encountered at depth in the world's oceans, as distinct from the fast ice fastened to shore in shallow depths close to the shore, people knew that salt water froze. But the theory was that at great depth and great distance from land, because of the turbulence of the water, that salt water did not freeze, but that instead the icebergs and the pack ice people encountered at great distance from land had to have emerged from a terrestrial form as a riverine outflow seasonally during the thaw, and that sailors would encounter this ice, but it was presumed to have come from a landform. And in fact, it was that corollary that led people to think there had to be a southern continent. But we now know, because of Cook, that sea ice will freeze on its own at depth. It has a lower freezing point than fresh water. But what had informed the theory that there had to be land from all of this ice to emerge was the fact that when you melt an iceberg or you melt pack ice, it yields fresh water. And that is what informed the theory that this ice had to be formed in land and then be discovered later at sea. Cook and the naturalist with him on his second voyage, Johann Reinhold Forster, did several experiments, but concluded that in fact, the ice does freeze in place. The low pack ice does, but Cook had an epiphany, and this scene you see here was highly relevant when he was visiting the island of South Georgia in the South Atlantic, an island later made famous by Sir Ernest Shackleton, when he glaciated into the neighboring harbor, neighboring to this one, Possession Sound. Cook saw glaciers calving off their face where it met the ocean, and he could see this is where the icebergs that he saw in great volume in the Southern Ocean must originate. But South Georgia was too small a place to be generating all of the icebergs he saw. And so Cook, though he never saw Antarctica and cannot be considered the discoverer of Antarctica, postulated in theory that a southern polar continent had to exist, because that had to be the generator of the great volume of icebergs he saw in sequence in the Indian, Pacific, and Southern Atlantic Oceans. Next slide. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in Cook's second voyage, by my estimation, of course, anthropologists always limit him to Polynesia, because that's where the famous encounters took place. But I think Captain Cook considered the single most exotic place he visited the second voyage. What you see here, a place he called Southern Thule, a derivation of Ultima Thule from ancient Greek legend, southernmost and distant place, which an inset of this image was included on Cook's chart, circumpolar chart of the South Pole on the second voyage. And if you look closely, you can see that Cook is actually pointing at this image in his official Admiralty portrait that was painted between his second and third voyages. Next slide. Moving now to North America, the third great Enlightenment era quest was the notion of a Northwest Passage, which had fascinated European navigators and European statecraft really ever since people like Columbus and Champlain discovered that there was a continent mediating sailing between Europe and Asia. And although the newfound lands, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, were obviously perceived to have value, the preceding notion that sent Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, Magellan out into the world's oceans still survived. It was kind of a fixed idea. There has to be a shorter way of getting from Europe to the Spice Islands of the East Indies or to the Asian market than going all the way under South America or all the way under South Africa. And so the image of a Northwest Passage endured for centuries after Columbus and that era of exploration. In the 1750s, French geographers began to populate speculative geography with images such as this, which if you look closely, you can see that there is a Western analog to Hudson Bay. This was called the Mer de l'Ouest. French geographers were always the most fanciful. Not that they alone did so, but it was thought that the point of this image is just to document the great interest, the enduring interest of looking for a Northwest Passage. And that's what Cook's third voyage aimed to do, except unlike all the previous attempts, unless you count Drake's in there, Cook was to attempt to find the passage going from the Pacific to the Atlantic, rather than Davis, Frobisher, Champlain, all of those folks attempting to look for the passage going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Next slide. I want you to remember this image too, because after the word of Vitus Bering's explorations for Russia in the 1740s and 50s began to gain circulation in the balance of Europe, more detailed formulations, such as this one that dates from the 1760s, began to populate geographic notions. Look at almost that elephantine extension of the Alaskan subcontinent. It actually tucks underneath the far east cape of Russia. This was the second to last map published conventionally in European geographic circles before Cook sailed looking for the Northwest Passage. And then the next slide. The last map to be published. In fact, it was a version of this was replicated by the the Royal Society, Great Britain's premier learned organization, duplicated this map. This was considered to be the most up-to-date geographic information of the North Pacific. You can see the Kamchatka Peninsula, but notice how if you look closely, Alaska now has shrunk from this elephantine structure to an island between the far east cape of Russia and this vague kind of rounded off promontory that's the northwestern extremity of North America. And the rest of that projection that tucked underneath the far east cape of Russia has been exploded into this imaginary archipelago, which was a gross, garbled misinterpretation of what we know as the Aleutian chain, which Russian fur traders post-Bering were beginning to populate in the geographic imagination of Europe. Next slide. Cook sailed for North America on his third and final voyage on the 11th of July, 1776. Now, for those of us south of the 49th parallel, that date kind of has a resonance in history, since the Declaration of Independence had literally been published a week earlier from Cook's sail. And in fact, Cook notes that in the slips next to him at Plymouth, he sees the Hessian soldiers boarding ships heading to North America to try to suppress the colonial rebellion. Cook finally makes it to the Northwest coast a year later than planned to Nootka Sound. Here in our own Pacific Northwest, this is a famous image of Cook's ship, Observatory Rock, not Friendly Cove that became more famous during the fur trade era and the Vancouver Gray, John Mears era, but Cook sailed a little bit in deeper. His directions were to make the northwest coast of North America, find a place to refresh wood and water before he reached his stated discovery zone, which was 65 degrees north. I emphasize that because Cook has come in for decades of criticism for not discovering the Columbia River, for missing the Strait of Juan de Fuca. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is that Cook and the people who sent him on his mission knew that any opening in the North American continent at 46 degrees north, like the Columbia, or 48 degrees north, like Fuca Strait, would inevitably lead to a dead end and not an all saltwater passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That's why Cook gave very cursory treatment to what we know today as the Northwest coast. His only stop of note was here at Nootka Sound before he proceeded north to his actual discovery zone. Next slide. Which Cook thought he had reached when, as you see in his map of Prince William Sound, now what later became known as Cook Inlet. Cook did not actually name the inlet that's named after him. He just simply thought there was maybe a river that flowed into this. Vancouver is the one that actually named Cook Inlet. And of course, Cook Inlet is where modern Anchorage, Alaska is located. This map that you see here is as exquisite in its cartographic detail as any map produced at any point in all three of Cook's voyages. Again, I emphasize that because the mythology has grown up for reasons we really don't have time to get into here in this meeting, but I probably belabor to some extent in my book, Captain Cook Rediscovered. The theory, the false, the fake, not fake, the mistaken theory that Cook was somehow a tired voyager. He wasn't his usual self. He should never have taken the third voyage, undertaken it because, for among other reasons, as was proved, he was killed, which somehow proves he was a diminished explorer. This whole mythology of Cook's deportment on the third voyage has grown up. And I just want to show this slide to prove, as I will with a couple of others later, the great refinement and exactitude Cook brought to his work until the very last day he lived. Next slide. Cook was eventually able to find a slot through the Aleutian Islands, as we know them today, off of Unalaska Island, English Bay, is where he docked or anchored temporarily. That's the same island Dutch Harbor, much more famous modern seaport, is located on. Cook was at the northeastern end of the island Dutch Harbor is on, and was finally able to navigate his way through the shoals off the Alaska coast, finally, and for the first time, accurately delineating the subcontinental dimensions of Alaska as we know it, made his way through the Bering Strait and into the ice pack of the Western Arctic, which you see depicted here. You might also note in the lower right, the artist in this question has decorated the scene in a fashion with some walruses in one of in a navigational feat of tremendous vigor and exactitude. Cook sailed along the Arctic ice edge for 15 to 20 degrees of longitude looking for a way around, through or around the Western Arctic ice pack. Of course, he could not. He was blocked, but he was frequently guided by the walruses who were populating the ice edge. And whenever he would hear the walruses barking, Cook knew he was near the pack. Next slide. This is another image I want you to remember. This shows the Bering Strait. You can see the East Cape of Asia, Cape Prince of Wales, one of the more exotically named place names in North America. The westernmost tip of Alaska forms the eastern gateway to Bering Strait. But I want to call your interest in particular to the track of Cook's path at the northern extremity of this image, because this documents what I verbalized earlier. Cook sailed along the edge of the Arctic ice pack for 15 to 20 degrees of longitude in fog, mist, sleet, guided as often by the walruses as by any other device, looking and pursuing his mission as diligently as could. Again, remember that track line as we proceed to the next image. This is an inset from a larger map I will show you later. This is from the master map produced by the Admiralty at the end of Cook's third voyage. Shows Cook's tracks for each voyage. And of course, you will recognize the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. If you look more closely, it's kind of faintly depicted, but you will see Cook's needle nose-like penetration to his deepest point towards the South Pole as he would engage in his several forays, again, in the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean. And this documents and stands in contrast to Cook's ice edge foray in the Arctic, because Cook's method, as you can see here, was to dive deep towards the South Pole, see if he could find the southern continent. He didn't, he wouldn't. He would meet the ice edge, he'd go back north to warm up, his crew was getting cranky, and then he'd dive deep again. So Cook's the divergence of Cook's methods between the second voyage, the icy latitudes of the second voyage and the icy latitudes of the third voyage, couldn't be more starkly contrasted by the succession of images I've just showed you. Next one, please, Darlene. This is Cook's map of Hawaii. You can see, again, you can detect his track off the Hawaiian, the big island of, it's called Oahe here, or Hawaii, we know it today. This is a tremendous controversy in Cook historiography. Naturally, perhaps one would expect, surrounds the place of his death on the Big Island. Historians have fundamentally misunderstood Cook's track around the Big Island. He was trying to preserve capital. He was trying to avoid the deleterious effect of venereal disease of his crew upon native people. Finally, Cook did come to port on the Big Island's roughly triangular. He finally found, or actually another noteworthy figure, later Captain Bligh, actually first navigated into Kealakekua Bay. And of course, it was there that Cook met his death on February 14th, 1779. The main point I make in my book relative to this is that when news first reached Great Britain, by way of Russia, interestingly enough, that Cook had died, one of the first published reaction was not a surprise that Cook had died. The surprise was that he had lived as long as he did, because as I document, and I think I'm the first to do this, Cook could have been killed in situations approximate to the one on which he was killed, upwards of 8 or 9 times, but had hairbreadth escapes. His luck finally ran out. His death was not a function of some diminished voyager, some mental disease, some other defect, some problem with his gut biome or whatever. Cook had just simply run out of good fortune, and he met his death in Hawaii in February 1779. Next slide.
Dave, just a heads up, can we another minute or so one.
Yeah, we're done.
Yeah.
This is my last slide. This is the master map published at the conclusion of Cook's voyage. You can see Australia, New Zealand. You see the Pacific Basin depicted accurately for the first time. The cartographic dimensions of the Alaska subcontinent roughly depicted accurately for the first time. This is the first modern map of the world. It's a function of Cook's 3 voyages to the Pacific primarily, but also to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. This is the thumbnail highlight of my book, Captain Cook Rediscovered. Our Darlene can put up the next slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time and attention.
Great. So if you're willing to take a few questions.
Sure.
Thanks. All right, just getting sorted here.
You can close that out, Darlene.
Okay.
Thank you.
So questions. So sorry, but Graham, you're on mute.
What was the date of the last map that you showed?
That was published with the Admiralty account of the official third voyage publication in June 1784.
5 years after his death.
Correct. It took a long time. The production, the logistical details of production were the most complicated for Cook's third voyage. It was the best illustrated. That master map was a master work in itself. It took a long time because remember, all of that detail has to be engraved in copper in reverse for a proof to be taken so that you can see the published image.
Interesting.
Questions? Penny?
Yeah, Dave, thank you very much. And you're obviously very, very, very knowledgeable about Captain Cook. Can you tell me how long you've been studying this? Is it sort of a lifetime study for you?
No, I came to Cook through the back door. My career interest kind of works ever backward to the preceding steps. So I started out frontier period, Oregon Trail. Then I went back to Lewis and Clark, did a little bit on Alexander Mackenzie again here. And I was kind of drawn to the Cook story because I guess you could say I'm an iconoclast, or some people refer to my work as being revisionistic. Revisionism has got a bad name lately because Holocaust deniers called themselves historical revisionists. Historical revisionism actually has a distinguished career in reputation in historiography, but the Holocaust deniers soiled it. So I thought it was time to take another look at Cook. I had a sense that historians were missing something. Historians are like any other subpart of the human species. They follow the path of least resistance. The aspect of Cook's voyages that has intrigued Western civilization since the time the Polynesian encounter first occurred was that human encounter. But in fact, Cook actually spent more time sailing in the icy latitudes than he did the tropical zone. And his missions for the second and third voyages had nothing to do with the tropics. The tropics for the second and third voyages were mere staging grounds. The first voyage mission to Tahiti, yes, that was the point of it. But the point of the second and third voyages was the extremes of the earth, not the Polynesian latitudes. And historians, because Cook historiography is dominated by anthropologists and ethnological discourse, Cook's entire polar career, if you will, has been completely ignored. That's the revision, the Cook study that I tried to bring.
Thank you.
Questions?
I have one.
Any time for one more? Yeah, Lindsay.
Oh, I just wanted to let you know that I went to Captain James Cook Elementary School in Vancouver. So
Ah.
that was pretty cool. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
well,
One
Well,
more
for-
question, Guillermo?
I was wondering if another protege of Cook, Lieutenant Puget, has caught your attention.
well, yeah, well, Lieutenant Puget sailed with Vancouver on Vancouver's voyage. There's a common misperception about Vancouver. Let me just kind of conclude with this, if indeed this is our last question, because I typified it very early on when I said historians of the Pacific Northwest have misunderstood Cook's voyage because they criticize him for missing the Columbia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But as I pointed out, this area, these latitudes weren't a part of Cook's mission. Nootka Sound was a staging area for Cook's third voyage every bit as much as Tahiti was, or New Zealand, or Cape Town. It was not the destination. And so he sailed by the Northwest coast rather quickly because he had no mission-related objective in these latitudes. And so historians have commonly posited Vancouver's voyage as an admiralty device to make up for some perceived shortcoming of Cook's third voyage. Vancouver was looking for an entirely different thing. He was looking for a successor cartographic image of the Northwest Passage. One actually closer to that French projection I showed you, where there was a Western analog to Hudson Bay. That is the Northwest Passage Vancouver was looking for. Of course, that doesn't exist either, at least not in the dimensions that was hypothesized. The Salish Sea, as it is now known, Straits of Georgia, Seymour Narrows, Queen Charlotte Straits, Puget Sound, Admiralty Inlet, all named by Vancouver. That does exist, but that was, and Puget, of course, was a lieutenant and explored the southernmost waters of the Salish Sea. Puget worked for Vancouver, but again, the fundamental point to understand here, Vancouver's mission was distinctly different and really in many respects completely unrelated to Cook's voyage of 1778.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David. That was very interesting. And to learn more about from way back about the start of exploration of this part of the world where we all live. And we're in awe about the technology that we have today and how that rapidly growing that is and what that allows us to do. But to think back then, the sailing into the unknown and the technology they had of the day to be able to produce those maps, as you've pointed out, is absolutely extraordinary if you put yourself in that frame. So thank you very much for enlightening us. And to thank you for your presentation today. We're making a contribution in your name to the End Polio campaign of Rotary International to thank you. So cheers to you.
Thank you.
And,
Bravo, bravo.